Hello, everyone. We're going to get started today. My name is Brittany, and I'm here today with the World Religion class. Thank you for joining our event, Breaking Stereotypes. We really appreciate it. Please enjoy the candy that's been placed in front of you, and then, enjoy. So today our topic is going to be against hate crime. So we do want to raise some awareness, and enlighten you guys. So we have 4 guest speakers today, and the first one I would like to... Actually, no, I'm not going to introduce him, my bad. First, I would like to introduce our professor, Professor Chabad.
So good morning, or good afternoon now. Good afternoon. So my name is Professor Bassem Shaban. I teach world religions here at Seminole State College, and this is part of a student project that my students at the class are performing. There's 3 other projects taking place in the community. The next on campus. The next one is tomorrow. Also dealing with civil rights and issues of extremism, racism, and discrimination. And then the other 2 are taking place next week. So at the end I'll explain the rest of them. But this one is very important because it's dealing with the serious problem of extremists and hate groups that exist in our nation. And in a time where there's unfortunately a lot of divisiveness and ignorance, we feel it really comes out of fear. And the importance of this project that my students are doing is essential for us to bridge the gap between our communities, whether based on ethnic, religious, any type of identity. We want to make sure that we understand each other for who we really are and not what we assume things to be. So you'll hear a lot from the experts in the field that are working on this issue on a regular basis, especially from the Department of Justice. But I want to make sure that you see the importance of what this project is for them. They've seen it more than just a grade, but this is something that they've really opened up to build awareness for themselves, and now they're trying to share it with the rest of the campus. So thank you for being here, and we hope that you enjoy the session and pass the information you learned today to others. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to show you a small presentation on PowerPoint explaining our group project that we did to inform people of several issues. For example, we tried breaking stereotypes, and that consisted of taking popsicle sticks and writing down what stereotype you were, and at the very end, breaking it in half to break that stereotype. The other one we had was the blind test. So what we technically did was we blindfolded people, to put them and block one of their main senses. Like, what would you guys do if you didn't have your eyes? I'd go crazy. There's too many beautiful things to see out there. So that's what we technically did. We went ahead and we blocked their eyesight, and we put them in the position of other people. Making it all pretty. That's Barbara bringing the pizza. Everyone loves pizza.
Some of the leaders improving one of our projects. This is us setting up before everyone started coming out of class. And we are about to break the wood of stereotypes. This is one of our blind test contestants, searching and trying to put Tupperware together blindly, which is what people do on a daily basis, and being guided. It's not easy going every day, not knowing what you're putting together. And this is our Dum Dum project, where he pulled one of the lollipops handing out flyers to other students for today's event. And these are some of the broken stereotypes. Ghetto, wimpy, lazy. This is the table that took the breaking of stereotypes. And our group photo.
So our next video is going to consist of our blind test. You guys are going to actually see actual footage of people being made blind and then being guided. Having trouble putting on it, covering his eyes, just a little bit of trouble. This guy looks so lost. So imagine how people actually feel every day. Okay, that's fine. Do you know where it's at? Okay. So our next project that we're going to show was the Breaking Stereotypes, and that was the one I explained earlier today that had the popsicle sticks and where you wrote a stereotype and you broke them. Honestly, this is one of my favorites because I personally don't like being a stereotype, but it's so hard to avoid being one because it happens so naturally. So it's a nice project to actually look at and think about later on, after you leave here. Just having a little bit of trouble. Just a little. Breaking stereotypes is hard, see? Awesome. So now I'm going to go ahead and give a little bios of who's presenting today. I'm going to start off today with Mr. Daniels. He's a former sworn law enforcement officer, acting field training officer, and a member of Special Narcotics and Felony Enforcement Unit. As a certified law enforcement instructor, he has served as a national adjunct instructor to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and Federal Law Enforcement. Training center on matters of involving domestic terrorism and hate crimes as an adjunct to the U.S. Department of Justice National Advocacy Center and Florida Regional Community Policing Institute at St. Petersburg College. Mr. Daniels has consulted with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Criminal Justice Standards, and Training Commission on curriculum development for law enforcement officers, and presents nationally and internationally on special matters involving human dynamics and diversity, community policy, and law enforcement and community. Relations, ex-offender reentry, and leadership potential. He endeavors has included specialized research, training, and technical assistance projects throughout the United States, Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. Next person we'd like to talk about is Rabbi K. Rabbi K is a member of the Mayor Buddy Dyer's Council of Clergy and the Executive Committee of Interfaith Council of Central Florida, for which he coordinates annual Interfaith celebration of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King with the Mayor's Commission on Martin Luther King Holiday. He serves congregation on Shalom in Maitland, Florida, founded in 1918. Ohei Shalom is Central Florida's original and oldest continuing Jewish congregation. Rabbi K lives in Orlando with his spouse, Joanne Goldman K. Their son, Jonah, is a student in joint program of Columbia University and List College in Manhattan. Pastor Jim Coffin is an executive director of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. He worked as a church pastor for 36 years before assuming his current role. He grew up on a farm in Missouri and has lived for an extended periods in Mexico, New England, and Australia. I'd love to live there, maybe one of those places. Not Australia, because it's kind of dangerous over there. And lastly, I would like to give you a small bio of Imam Musri, the president and senior imam of the Islamic Society of Central Florida, and the president of American Islam. He is a member of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. He is a member of the Valencia Peace and Justice Institute, and he is one of the 3 wise guys on the weekly radio program. It's pretty cool. I like to be on the radio. And Friends Talking Faith on the 90.7 FM, the NPR affiliate. Guys, let's please give a round of applause, please, for wonderful people. And I'd also ask you guys to please stay seated. I don't want anyone to be rude. Also, there's going to be food and drink at the very end. So please hold on to your raffle cards because there will also be a raffle. Enjoy, guys. So I'd like to present Mr. Daniels to go first. And present.
Well, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom. Peace. What's happening?
How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. First of all, I want to thank Professor Shaban for continuing to do this. We've met some time ago, doing much of the same work with regard to diversity issues and trying to bring some resolution to this human conflict that seems to perpetuate itself time and time again, rearing its ugly head in some of the most violent forms and ways. To have his class to explore the depths of these issues, I think is very, very crucial to learning, regardless of whatever your academic pursuit or discipline is. For regardless of what field of endeavor you will enter, you will be dealing with human beings. And you will also, as we know now, the world is borderless. It continues to expand, and these interactions become more prevalent on a day-to-day basis. It's sad to say that in 2016, we're still wrestling with the issues of getting along. So much so that millions of dollars in resources are allocated to the prevention, the investigation, enforcement, and prosecution of individuals or groups who would seek out differences and utilize those differences to foment hate, acts of violence, planned attacks, up to genocide. Our department is certainly no stranger to this, the Department of Justice, that is. We're made up of people. We have limited resources, and part of our role is to prosecute those crimes, specifically when they fall at our door and impact our local communities. I'm just happy to say that in working with programs like this, that we're able to at least raise the discussion in a civil manner, that we're able to come together to try to find some type of resolution, if only but to mitigate the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I think it's important. I think it is absolutely necessary if we're going to exercise our freedom, if we're going to be able to realize our greatest human potential, which is what institutions like this is designed to do, to help you hone those talents, those skills, and direct them into your community, into your professions, and into your families. These discussions have to be raised. These issues have to be examined. I can think of no better place than an institution of higher learning to do that, and to actually have you transcend and take that information and what you've learned into the community. You will be the ones who will challenge us to push the next chapter, to do what is right. Still today, in 2014, if you look at the statistics with regard to hate crimes, some of those vile acts that seems to play themselves out in this country, 2014, we had still staggering numbers. One is too many. There are approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies full-time in the United States of America. That includes state, local, federal special jurisdiction agencies. And out of the 18,000 in 2014, we had about 15,494 to participate in the hate crime statistic program, the gathering of information as far as attacks or incidents. Out of that 15,494, only 1,666 reported incidents. That only is 10% of the agencies available to participate reported. That means that the other 89.2% said that we have no hate crimes. I find it hard to believe. But those 1,666 actually reported 5,479 hate crime incident involving 6,418 offenses, producing 6,681 victims. And out of those, I've been doing this work for quite some time with regard to the department, that is, and I still see this top three categories continual as far as being victims: race, religion, sexual orientation continue to be the top three categories in which persons are targeted because of their beliefs or characteristics. In the state of Florida, out of those participating agencies, 505 agencies in the state of Florida reported an incident, roughly about 20 million people. And 500 agencies participated, but only 37 out of those 1,666 agencies reported an incident, 65. You look at the Florida Attorney General report, theirs may be a little bit larger, but needless to say that the issue still persists. So one of the things that we're learning, we're seeing is that the hate groups, if you look at the research that is done by the Southern Poverty Law Center and their intelligence project, from 2014 to 2015, there was a 14% increase in hate crimes as far as not hate crimes, but hate groups. As far as the radical right, it went from 2014, 784 to 892 in 2015. Patriot groups went from 874 in 2014 to 998 in 2015. And then probably the most impactful and staggering number is Stormfront. That web-based, the internet, the virtual group, boasts a membership right now of 300,000 members, and it adds approximately 25,000 members annually to its role. So you can see even when there's not a physical connection, there's a virtual connection that is fomenting this. If you look at the Charleston, South Carolina church attack at Mother Emanuel, this was an incident where Dylan Roof said he was radicalized with the ideas from the ideas. And so the top 5 states still continue to be. I've been here since 1998. The top 3 states, Florida has always, as far as organized hate groups, Florida's always been in the top 3. Texas, California, Florida, and the other 2, Tennessee and Pennsylvania. So we have not lost our ranking in Florida with regard to the number of organized hate groups reported here, and that number has gone up. I think it's important to look at all of these groups, whether they be based on hate, based on their race, whether it be based on ethnicity or anti-government sentiment. Interesting report, because Census 2043 says that the projection will be that the whites will lose the majority. This seems to be a foment for that. We saw record numbers with the election of President Barack Obama in 2008, more threats against the president than any others combined in history. Secret Service stretching their resources to protect. Pew study now says that in November that only 19% of Americans have faith in government, some point, or full-time faith. And the Kaiser's report, 29% says racism is still an issue in America. That means 1/2 of Americans still believe that racism is still an issue. So this is an issue that does not have any expedient resolution. But I think it's worthy of our attention, and I think that this is the right place for you to begin to formulate those ideas and those strategies. And you will hold the answer, I think, to driving, to changing that next chapter in our history. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Next, I'd like to present to you guys Rabbi Kay.
Thank you. I'm going to further dissect one of those statistics. I peeked before. 18.6% of reported hate crimes in 2014 were against faith groups, and as I understand it, still the number one, if you will, on that hit parade is the Jewish community, and number two, and unfortunately closing fast, is the Muslim community. But you have to put that in its full context. The Pew Foundation, when they did their study on faith in America a couple of years ago, 75% of respondents self-identified as Christian. About 2.5% self-identified as Jews, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 1%, plus or minus a little bit, identified as Muslims. So if most of your faith-based hate crimes are being focused on two groups who combined are less than 5% of the population, that's way, way out of line. You would expect there to be a disproportionate number anyway, because they're minorities, but it's much larger than it looks on paper. Plus, you have to figure that if, in the raw numbers, in the percentage of hate crimes reported, if a certain percentage are directed towards Jews, and a slightly less percentage are directed toward a group within the United States who are about half the number of Jews, then really the person per person, you are actually talking about a much larger potential for a Jew or a Muslim to experience a hate crime than anyone else. Anti-Semitism persists. It's been out of fashion for a while. It's just not politically correct. It's not polite to speak in that way, but that doesn't mean it's gone away. Instead, it's sort of gone underground into a kind of what I like to call stealth anti-Semitism, and that manifests itself in a couple of ways. One is in code speak, where things are said which are not overtly anti-Semitic, but those who know what it means. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Don't you get it? Very recently, in the current presidential campaign, which has not helped to increase the level of dialogue in the United States, unfortunately, one of the candidates, and I'm not picking on anybody, so I'm not naming names, one of the candidates accused another candidate of having, quote unquote, New York values. The Jewish community reacted immediately to that statement, because quite often when you say somebody is a New York fill in the blank, because the city of New York has a proportionately larger Jewish population, quite often that is veiled anti-Semitic speak. So immediately, because a lot of times you'll hear, oh, you're talking like a New York lawyer. That means, you're talking like a stereotypical Jew. So there was an immediate reaction from the Jewish community there. It just so happened, by the way, that the candidate who was being told that he had New York values has a daughter who converted to Judaism, so it hit even closer to home. The second way that stealth anti-Semitism often presents itself is in so-called religious freedom legislation. Because religious freedom legislation is really a way of privileging one particular faith tradition over others, which is contrary to the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. And Jews are particularly sensitive to this because throughout our history, when there has been an assertion of those majority faith tradition rights or alleged rights, it has almost always led to some sort of disempowerment or disenfranchisement or even outright oppression of minority religions, particularly Judaism, because quite often that majority religion in Europe and here in the United States also has a history of wanting to delegitimize Judaism. Not everyone who belongs to that faith tradition. I don't want to. No stereotypes, right? We're breaking those. The third way that stealth anti-Semitism manifests itself is in discussions about the state of Israel. I want to make it clear that there is legitimate criticism of the state of Israel, as there is for any nation on earth, I've got issues with things that the Israeli government does. I have issues with the politics in Israel. However, I'm not an Israeli. I'm an American Jew. So I only have so much influence on what happens in the politics of another country, even if it's one that I have a religious and a cultural and historical tie to. There is also legitimate conversation to be had about many controversial issues. However, much of the criticism that one might hear and much of the conversation that one might hear, which critiques Israel and Israeli governments and Israeli policies, is classical anti-Semitic language which is masked as legitimate critique. When you start to dissect it and you start to try and have the legitimate conversation, what you end up getting is classical anti-Semitic canards. You run the media, you want to take over the world, a lot of stuff which just doesn't hold up in an intelligent conversation. I want to add to this, by the way, my own personal experience growing up. I grew up in Chicago, but I grew up in a neighborhood which was virulently racist and anti-Semitic. I attended the last unintegrated high school in the city of Chicago, and when my high school, long after I had graduated it, was finally integrated, when the first African-American students attended my high school, there were violent protests by people in the neighborhood. And this, ladies and gentlemen, was the late 1970s. That's how far behind we were on the curve. Martin Luther King actually, in an interview in the mid-1960s, was asked if he ever feared for his life while he was protesting, and he mentioned two incidents. One was the march in Selma, which has been enshrined in the film of the same name, and the other was an open housing march in my old neighborhood, where he feared for his life. That's how violent it was. The people who were around him, who were in my neighborhood. So I have an idea of how this stuff works. I grew up with people who proudly became neo-Nazis, and I know the taste and the smell and the size and the shape of anti-Semitism because I experience it in my childhood on an almost daily basis. So, this is not knee-jerk, folks. This is coming from personal experience. The one other thing that I would want to mention is, Judaism has been a perpetrator of extremism in its history. Fortunately for us, we took care of most of that in antiquity, so we can be rather smug about talking about other people's more recent history, which is still within memory. Ours is all enshrined in the Bible, so we can say, that was so long ago, it doesn't even matter. However, I would point out that we did enshrine our bad behavior in our primary sacred text. If you read, the books of Samuel and the books of Kings, our guys behaved really, really badly. And we retained that for posterity for a couple of reasons. One is really to remind us of our own past. So before we point a finger at somebody else and say, well, those folks are behaving badly, therefore we must be suspicious of everybody, we should first read our own primary sacred text and say, be a little careful before you start leveling generalizations at people. A second one is really to keep us humble. Just because we're not, just because we're not in the news right now doesn't mean that at some time in our history we weren't in the equivalent of the internet, whatever that was, 3,000 years ago. And I think it also stands as a warning for us today, and a responsibility, really, as well. I will conclude by saying extremism and fundamentalism certainly exists in every faith tradition, and Judaism is no exception. As is true for every faith tradition, though, those incidents of extremism or fundamentalism in Judaism are not normative. They don't define Judaism. They're not mainstream. And they are rejected by everyone except the extremists and the fundamentalists. And I think I will just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Kay. So next I'd like to present to you guys Pastor Jim Coffin.
I'm a Christian pastor, so I represent the majority, the Christian majority here in this country. And the theme that we're looking at is civil rights, hate, and extremism. And Christianity has played both a very positive role in creating more civil rights, but there's also a segment of Christianity that has always played a very negative role in the advance of civil rights. So there's this tension within Christianity in terms of granting civil rights. And we do have a rather checkered history as far as this nation is concerned. Going back several hundred years to kind of the founder of religious liberty, which is one civil right, Roger Williams was not only excommunicated from his congregation, but he was also banished from the colony of the Massachusetts Bay Colony because of the fact that he was a bit of a heretic, and among other things, he advocated for fair treatment of the Native Americans who were here and whose land was being taken, and he said that the Christians who were buying that land were not paying fair value for it, and so that was one of the problems why he was thrown out. And Roger Williams was the one who who actually coined the expression, which was later used by others who came on the scene. He talked about the separation that should exist, the wall of separation between government and between religion. And so that wall of separation hasn't always existed. Although this country was settled in main part by people who were coming to find religious liberty, they very quickly didn't grant religious liberty to other people. They wanted it for themselves. And I believe one of the most crucial values in all spirituality and all faith traditions is, we sometimes call it the golden rule, but I think it probably is better to call it the ethics of reciprocity. The ethics of reciprocity, and that is that I want for everyone the same kind of things that I would want for myself. And so that's important, and we haven't done too well. But fortunately, we've kind of corrected course as we go along. But when new things arise, we don't always look to history and gain insights into how to deal with the new. Just a few examples. William Penn got a charter to found Pennsylvania. William Penn was a Quaker. Quakers were persecuted in England. And so he wanted to make sure that there was no persecution. He wanted to live free, for Quakers to live free of persecution. But he said, in Pennsylvania, no polytheists. And he put Hinduism in that category. So Hindus were not welcome in Pennsylvania, nor were atheists welcome in Pennsylvania. Here in Georgia, just to our north, James Oglethorpe was a great philanthropist, and he said we need to create a colony where people who are being imprisoned just for debts and so on need to be free. So Georgia was a penal colony originally, and so when he got the charter, and this goes back to about 1730, 1732, somewhere around there, he got the charter for Georgia, and he wanted to have religious freedom, with the exception that there were to be no Catholics in Georgia, and there were to be no Jews in Georgia, and there were to be no lawyers in Georgia, because he had a stereotype about lawyers, and he'd had a bad run-in with them, and so they were to be excluded from the colony. And it just so happened that Savannah was facing some kind of a plague, and a shipload, about 80 people, if I remember correctly, of Jews had come over from Portugal, where they were being persecuted in Europe and were trying to find safe haven here, but they came to the wrong place because they came into Savannah Harbor, where Jews weren't allowed in this new colony. But there was a Jewish doctor on board. And they didn't have a doctor in Savannah, and they were dealing with some kind of a plague. I don't remember if it was smallpox or just exactly what it was. So they said, well, maybe in this case, maybe we could allow a Jew to come aboard. And so they brought him. He worked his wonders as a good Jewish doctor. And then they said, well, maybe the whole shipload could get off as well. And so things began to change. But we have this history where we have had a bad track record of religion. We've had a bad track record of dealing with race. I mean, really, it's only about 150 years ago, give or take just a little bit, that we still had slavery in this country. I mean, that's not that far away. And then we've had the gender discrimination, and we haven't granted civil rights to women, and that's less than 100 years that women have had the vote in this country. And then, we are now facing the issue of sexual orientation and how we deal with people who are outside the mainstream, and we have the same kind of situation arising that we've had all along, and that is within the Christian majority, we have a group of people who are vociferously saying we need to grant civil rights to this group who have been disenfranchised, and we have another group who are saying, no, absolutely categorically, and we shouldn't have to serve them. We shouldn't have to do whatever it is. And it's a very sobering reality that we've gone through so many of these experiences over so many years. And fortunately, we've corrected course, or at least worked toward correcting course. But when new things arise, we don't seem to have learned the lessons of history. With hate, and I was talking about civil rights a bit, hate and extremism tie into it. With hate, we just as human beings seem to love to hate. There has to be some scapegoat. There has to be somebody who has created this problem. And sometimes that's based on the fact that we had a bad experience with one member of that group, whoever that group was, or 2 members or 3 members or whatever. But very often it's something that we picked up secondhand from somebody else. And we have, we're just not happy with the way life goes. And so we choose the scapegoat, and we try to hang everything on that scapegoat. And actually, it's not so hard to understand, really, because whenever we've been at war, we always have to create an attitude of hate toward the enemy. And so if we're fighting Germany, or if we're fighting Japan, or whoever it might be that we're fighting, or if we're fighting the American Indians, the Native Americans, we have to portray them as being undeserving, as being less than human, really. And so they deserve what we're doing to them. And that's part of being able to prosecute war, and it's part of what's necessary for us to perpetuate hatred. Is we have to say whoever it is that is the object of our hatred and scorn actually deserves it. And we actually do that officially in government whenever we're at war. We try to make the other, whoever it is, we can't stop and think about the other as being, this is the son of a mother who's at home hoping he'll come back from the war alive. And even in our prayers in Christian settings, we pray for our servicemen, and we pray that they will come back alive, but are we concerned about the death and so on that's taking place to the enemy who we think are deserving of what they get? Because we've been propagandized is what it really boils down to. Extremism I don't understand completely, but very often extremism is based on good intention. And I say this because I happen to deal with the second in command. Those of you who have heard about the Branch Davidian debacle in Waco, Texas, and this goes back before many of you were born, but the second in command was a man named Steve Schneider, who I went to school with. And he had gone off and sowed his wild oats and left his religious moorings, and he came back after having wandered in the decadent world for a decade or so. He came back and wanted to try to get his life right spiritually. Now, he'd found it unsatisfying before when he was young and growing up. He'd left it. So when he came back, there has to be something better. And so he was looking for perfection. He was looking for something that would satisfy more. And so here comes a charismatic leader along and says, if you follow me, this and this and this and this is going to happen. And this friend of mine, who was seemingly rational, bought into it. and he ended up burning in the conflagration that took place there at Waco. And so when you combine all of these things, the civil rights issue, the hate, and the extremism, it can create a very volatile cocktail. And actually, none of us are immune to being illogical and inconsistent about civil rights. None of us are immune to hate. And really, none of us are immune to extremism either. So we have to be on guard at all times. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Jim Coffin. Okay, last but not least, I'd like to announce Imam Musri.
Thank you. First, go ahead. I tried to look at the different types of hate and extremism that society is plagued with. Found that religious hate always tops the list. People kind of justify their hate of other groups based on religious reasons because they tend to have absolute views that they are right and everybody else is wrong. They're going to heaven, everybody else going to hell. So they want to hasten that in this world. Second type is political hate generated from political differences. Every day we see it, we hear it. Sometimes it's not very extreme, but at times some politicians, they utter extreme statements against one another. Racism based on race and ethnicity historically has happened across religious groups, within religious groups, and xenophobia. We have also, as mentioned earlier by Pastor Jim, hate as a result of war. When we go to war, we have to hate the enemy or the group we are fighting against. And historically, every war we went for, we were prepared to hate those people and to justify whatever happens to that group. Next. So there is a cycle where it all starts with ignorance. You know, it's very hard to hate people you really know, to hate yourself or your own group because you know them very well, or to hate your neighbors that you actually have a lot of information about and understand their culture or their religion. But often it starts with a group that you know nothing about, that you're prepared to accept or assume wrong things about. And that ignorance leads to fear of that unknown. You fear what you don't know, and it's a natural human reaction built into us for preservation purposes. And it generates hate. And that hate, either we can control it because of training and understanding and going back to the source and say, because I don't know, I want to know more about these people or these animals or this part of nature so I can stop fearing it and hating it. Or hate overtakes you and you don't deal with it and leads to extremism. Extremism takes many forms, and one of its worst forms is violence, where you translate your extreme views and hate against a group or individual by carrying out violence against them, which in turn perpetuate this cycle, because as violence breaks out, people react to it and sort of confirm what you feared. Of course, if you attack someone, they're going to defend themselves and attack you back. If you attack a cat or a dog or an animal, it's just going to confirm your fear of that animal, let alone other people. Next. Now, religious hate, I want to speak, as my colleagues spoke about their faith tradition, about Islam versus what's known now, ISIS, the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State. A lot of people conflate the two. Even some political candidates today, they don't want to separate between Islam, the faith, the religion of 1.7 billion people in the world, all over the world, and over 1,400 years, with a group calling itself an Islamic State, a terrorist group, which is small in number, confined geographically into a certain area. It is born from another group that we known before, Al-Qaeda, and a very recent in history. And it is important to understand the difference between the two. Now, because we in the US are against ISIS or at war with ISIS as a terrorist group, it is understood that the government would launch propaganda against this group, and we believe it to be true. You know, whatever the government is classifying the group is correct. As a Muslim, I know this group is killing Muslims. They are not Islamic in their behavior, and but it is natural to expect that this terrorist group is going to fight back, and they're not big and strong to confront us in a battlefield, but they use terrorism as a weapon of choice, as we have seen in San Bernardino and in Paris and Brussels recently. And they're doing it. As I drove here, they said they carried out several bombings in Iraq today, and 29 people were killed. Now, these people are Muslims who are being killed every day. As a matter of fact, every day ISIS carries out bombings and killings of fellow Muslims. Okay? 99% of their victims are Muslims. The best number I know that they killed of Americans are 18. But they have killed tens of thousands of fellow Muslims. Next. Now, coming to hate, here in the U.S., and Mr. William Daniels mentioned it earlier, the Southern Poverty Law Center says that we have about 895 hate groups in the U.S. today. And this is a map showing where they are, and here in Florida we have quite a bit of them. And you can visit their site to see it up close. Next. This rise has gone up really from, take 99 where it was down in the 500 range, to around the second term of Obama where it exceeded 1,000. It has come down some, but recently in 2015 it jumped about 14%. These are the number of groups, not individuals. Each group may have, you know, small or a very large number. Next. Now, individuals act sometimes part of a group or on their own, but the outcome is the same. The outcome is the loss of life, the destruction that does not resolve this, but kind of encourages others to copycat what they did. Mr. Page had attacked in Wisconsin the Sikh temple, and some said that he thought it was an Islamic center, which doesn't make a difference, but you know, attacking someone for their religious identity is awful. Next. Also, Mr. Daniels mentioned the Charleston massacre and these 9 precious lives were lost in a church. So even though it's a religious place, again, here, sort of a Christian on Christian. Next. And locally here we had vandalism at the mosque by this individual, and it is under investigation right now. And it's clearly also hate motivated. So in all of these cases, we see that if you probably ask this individual what did he know about Islam or Muslims, he would know nothing. And that ignorance, that cycle, is generating a lot of people. Recently, there was a showdown in Anaheim between Ku Klux Klan group and people who counter-protested, and some people got hurt as they used the flagpoles, spears to hit each other. Also, very recently in Texas, several times a group calling themselves BEAR, the Bureau of American Islamic Relations, they have protested in front of mosques in Texas, carrying their arms and their guns, trying to intimidate the Muslim community there. And they did so in South Dallas a few days ago, and at that place the Nation of Islam came out with their guns. So the two groups both had their arms out, and the police had to be the buffer. Luckily, no one got hurt, but this process continues. I want to conclude by saying, it is sad to see that political candidates during the election cycle are kind of reviving and breathing life into some of the hate groups that have been dormant or have been out of place, and bringing them to the mainstream and allowing them to speak openly and publicly and recruit. The Ku Klux Klan was distributing papers or leaflets in Alabama, openly calling people to join the Klan to fight against Muslims. And that kind of invitation by some mainstream politicians playing on the fears and the ignorance of the public it's a dangerous trend that we hope it will end. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, guys, we're going to move on to question and answers. So if any of you have any questions for one of these wonderful guest speakers, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and we're going to go ahead and answer your questions. Anyone?
Bueller?
No questions on this side? No questions on that side? No one's got a question? You got a question? You got a question.
I have a question for Mr. Danny. You work for the Department of Justice, right?
That's correct, U.S. Attorney's Office.
The law enforcement is using racial profiling in order to kind of like surveil minorities. That's where we have like higher crime rates. What do you think needs to be applied to government policies in order to kind of like bring that down?
Well, officially, the Department of Justice does have an anti-profiling and with regard to the investigative agencies. It definitely has an anti-discrimination policy with regard to all of its implementation practices, with regard to it be investigative, prosecutorial, or whatever. I mean, that is a standing policy for the department. We regularly do engage in training with regard to our law enforcement investigative partners. As the U.S. Attorney's Office, we specifically don't investigate per se. We have what we call client partner agencies, be it the FBI, DEA, ATF, who bring those cases to us. But in all of those implementation practices, whether it be investigations or prosecution, even reviewing a case with regard to charging that case, the policies still stand. That said, your organizations are only as good as your individuals. Organizations are made up of people. And so there's a constant need for not only just training, but for education, for people sitting down to talk about these differences and not to just to shoo them away and say, well, you know, and we smile through a thin veneer. We try to, one of the things that we're doing actually right now is what we call our civil discourse series, where we're talking about the issues that may be social contributors and causes to crime. You can't talk about racism without talking about poverty, about talking about health disparities, without talking about all these other issues. With our law enforcement practice and our training through our law enforcement coordination training program, we regularly talk about the best tools to be utilized with regard to getting a case. Specifically, something that we've been working on since 2003 that we're redoing now, we just trained 35 law enforcement officers from 17 agencies in the Middle District of Florida, what we call About Face, Turning Away from Hate. Does exactly what we're talking about here. I showed part of this to Professor Shaban's class about 3 or 4 months ago, but it talks about addressing those issues of subtle bias, rising all the way to the level, if they're not unchecked, to genocide. So persons who have that power to charge someone with a crime, who can impede their locomotion, to incarcerate them, to make them post a bond, we have to make sure that they're specifically looking through a lens of objectivity. Probably more cases that we've charged in our district, the Middle District constitutes 35 of Florida's 67 counties. The department last year charged about, Department of Justice entirely, charged about 151 cases of civil rights, and that includes some hate crime cases, also includes what we call color of law cases, means persons acting under official authority, abusing that authority, depriving persons of civil rights. We've charged in this district in 2014, 2015, actually, more under the color of law as far as law enforcement agencies than we actually have hate crimes. On the books last year, we charged federally 2 hate crimes. One was a threat to a mosque, and one was a cross burning. Right now, the U.S. Attorney is currently in one part of the division right now actually prosecuting a case starting his trial today against a deputy who abused a drug defendant's right while effecting the arrest, who had surrendered. There were 5 charged in that case, 4 pled guilty, and 1 is going to trial today. And so part of it is to educate ahead of the time. We talk a lot about prosecution and enforcement and investigation, but probably the 2, I think, most critical pieces are prevention of having this happen in the first place, and then reconciliation should something does take place. So our policy is strong, it's clear, but it's only as strong as those who enforce that policy. And in an organization, it goes back to having these conversations and raising these critical issues and make sure that we hold everybody to task.
So before we move on to food and drink, I'm going to once again have Professor Chaban come and take the mic for a second or so.
So, did you learn something new today? Yes? Raise your hand if you learned something new today. Okay, very good. Do you think you're going to use what you learned today as a call to action in your lives and pass it on to other people? Yes? Okay. So, I really want to thank all of you for coming and learning about this serious issue in our community that unfortunately the media doesn't cover as much. And this is part of why we used it as an opportunity to really reflect on some of the atmosphere that's taking place in the nation right now and also around the world. When I invited Mr. Daniels to come to my class early in the semester, I wanted my students first and foremost to be aware of this issue. And all of them were very shocked to hear of all the statistics and the numbers, but also of how many people are affected by these attacks and racism and discrimination. So unfortunately, we live in a world full of stereotypes. And when the students came up with the idea of breaking stereotypes with a symbolic gesture of writing your own personal stereotype on a stick and breaking it, first they wanted to make sure we don't hurt anybody while they're breaking them, so they made sure to get thin wood. But the symbolism of action is very essential in our communities. Many times we talk about these issues, we see documentaries, we learn about it, and then we move on. We don't think about it. So I'm calling upon each and every single one of you as faculty, as students, as community leaders, to really reflect on the seriousness of where we are in our history. And literally this year, either we are voting leaders that will send us back into a time of darkness, or we vote for leaders that are going to move us for a progressive future to make our country and hopefully the rest of the world a better place to live. So make sure to understand the seriousness of this topic and where we're at. With that, I want to thank our speakers for their busy schedules. Each of these individuals are very active in their community. So as a token of our appreciation from the students, we have some gift baskets that we can give them right now. You can bring them right now so they can see them for themselves. We want to really thank them for their time, their insight, their wisdom, and anytime you have any questions or you want more resources from each of their communities, you can always reach out for them, and that information will be on our Facebook. So help me thank the speakers one more time. One second. Hold on one second. Hold on. Pause it. So we hope you enjoy. I believe there's no alcohol in them, right, students? Sparkling wine. So thank you very much. We do have a few more things to finish up since we finished up a little early. I want you to see a very important video from the Department of Justice. It's a fun video. It's very fun in its approach, but it's really dealing with the issue that we discussed. So let's start from the beginning. So we want to really thank Mr. Daniels and his office at the Department of Justice for the leadership that they present. If we can get the lights up. And you have to imagine this earth we live in literally as an island. And all of us have our own views of the world. Either we learn how to live together in peace and harmony and use our diversity for the betterment of our community, or unfortunately we're going to, sink altogether. So it's important to see why we're doing this. I really want to thank all my students for their hard work. They've worked pretty much the whole semester on this effort, many of them for the first time, so they can use this as a talent and a skill into their future, all through the communicational hardship they had with their groups. And again, we want to also mention about another interfaith event happening tomorrow with another class that I have dealing with the influence of the media over our societies and how it does affect how we look at each other. Then the other classes next week at Altamont at 7:30, they're dealing with racial profiling. And then the last one will be at Oviedo, dealing with issues of immigration and how we look at this policy of immigration based on our values and principles. So if your professors want to give you extra credit, I'll honor that. If not, I think if you just show up, you'll learn a lot and you'll grow as a student. and as a human being at the end of the day. So with that, we have the food will be available for you. I know we starved you all the way to the end. And then there's a symbolic gesture we like you to sign. This is a banner, Breaking Stereotypes. If you want to sign your name as an official attendee and as a call to action, a simple, innocent call to action that you're going to live up to the principles that you learned about today and hopefully make your community a better place. Thank you very much and hope to see you soon. Take care.